Hey, hello everybody. Thank you for coming. We're going to get started tonight. I just want to let you all know that you are being recorded. We are not letting, it's a Zoom webinar format, so the audience will not be on screen, or we won't have the webinar chat going to each other, to everyone. But you are welcome to ask questions through the Q&A function, which you'll find in the black bar at the bottom of your Zoom screen, right in the middle. So please use that to ask any questions, and we'll do our best to get as many questions answered as possible. To start tonight, I wanted to introduce myself and then my co-chair. I am Katie Cutchell. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Hillsborough County Democratic Committee. My co-chair here is Bev Cotton. She is going to be our moderator tonight, and we could not have picked a better person to moderate on this subject matter. Bev wears many hats in addition to being the co-chair of the county committee. She's treasurer for the Ware Democrats. She does tons of advocacy work for the AARP and the American Cancer Society, and she continuously champions for our rights to fair and free elections and a strong democracy. Bev is on the board and very active with Open Democracy New Hampshire, which is an excellent group dealing with election law and other election-related matters. So she's my constant resource on this subject matter being discussed tonight, and a perfect person to moderate. So welcome to all of you, and welcome to Bev.
Thank you, Katie. Wow. That made me sound way better than I really am, but I liked it. Thanks. I have pestered this poor man for a few years now. I run into him at the State House, and he always gets corralled. I always have a question or two or three or so for him about various matters. And tonight, I thought I would give everybody else the opportunity that I've had at the State House to ask him some questions of your own. So I first am going to thank Secretary Scanlan for being here. He does a wonderful service for the state of New Hampshire and has for quite some time, previously as deputy with Bill Gardner. We are going to listen to Secretary Scanlan talk a little bit about our First in the Nation situation, I will call it, and some of the things that we're looking down the road at for the election in the fall. We're going to start there, and then we'll move on to some questions. So thank you so much, Secretary Scanlan, for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Bev. It's a pleasure to be with you. I actually spent the day boiling down maple syrup with Bill Gardner at a sugar house that he has. And so if my voice gets a little raspy, it's because of all the steam that I was breathing earlier today. But we'll just go from there. Before I make comments about the elections related stuff, I'd just like to say that the Secretary of State's office is actually a pretty good sized state agency. And in addition to running the elections for New Hampshire, we have several divisions that do other really important things, like the Corporations Division, which we register any business entity that operates in the state of New Hampshire. We have the Bureau of Securities, which regulates broker-dealers and registers mutual funds and financial instruments, and they regulate that industry. We have the State Records and Archives, which is a really neat place if you're interested in history. We have some of the state's most precious historical documents housed up there. And it's a great place to go and just do some research. And also housed in that same building is the Division of Vital Records, which keeps track of births and deaths, marriages, divorces, adoptions, just statistical information about individuals and their lives in New Hampshire. And if you're interested in genealogy, that is a really neat place to go and just kind of research your pedigree and your ancestors. And the fact that it's in the same building with state archives, is a really unique opportunity to, look at genealogical history and other history that can be associated with your relatives. among other things. So I have a lot of other responsibilities besides just elections, but that is really, elections are the most exciting part of the job, and the one that I'm sure that your attendees are interested in hearing about today. So what I'd like to do is just start off talking about the presidential primary that we just held. New Hampshire has had the first in the nation presidential primary now for 104 years. And so it is a part of our culture. We have strong traditions that are associated with that election. If you come into the primary office and the Secretary of State's office, you can look at all of the photographs on the wall of the past major candidates that have campaigned here. It's a really neat display, and we're actually running out of space in that room. So that's a testament to just the history that we have with that election. This past election that we just had was different in a number of respects. There were some historical items that happened related to this election. The first one was the Democratic National Committee, as a committee, tried to change up the presidential primary, early calendar. And they pushed the state of Iowa and their caucus for the Democrats completely out of the early window. They attempted to push New Hampshire back to the second primary, to coincide on the same day with the state of Nevada, and then followed shortly thereafter by Michigan. And the president, with his direction to the DNC, tried to make South Carolina as the first in the nation event in terms of the Democratic presidential primary. And so that was a challenge that I think we headed off in pretty good shape. The great thing about New Hampshire was both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party were very supportive, and they were aligned in New Hampshire maintaining that first presidential primary position. So that was really important right out of the gate. And then the second part was just the messaging to the rest of the country about how New Hampshire was going to react to that status, that we were going to continue to hold the first in the nation primary, regardless of what the penalties might be. And so that messaging was very, very important. A wrinkle in that, however, was for a while, it appeared like the Iowa Democrats were going to attempt to go ahead and hold an early caucus on the same day as the Iowa Republicans, but they wanted to change their event up, moving away from a traditional caucus to a totally mail-in event. And the minute that they start receiving any caucus type state would start receiving absentee ballots or mail-in ballots, where there's broad general participation, that event looks a lot more like a primary than it does a caucus. And so we had to put our foot down in that regard with the Iowa Democrats, and just let them know that we would view that attempt to be a threat if they were going to go ahead and do a mail-in event on the same day that the Republicans were holding their first in the nation caucus. So there were some strong feelings, not only with the Democrats, but also with the Republicans in caucus, because they felt for a while that New Hampshire might also jump their event to maintain the first in the nation primary status. Fortunately, the Democrats in Iowa decided that they were going to go ahead and hold their mail-in event, but they were not going to receive all of their mail-in ballots and announce the results until March 5th, which was Super Tuesday. And the minute they made that decision, it took that issue off the table, and we no longer had to worry about that. President Biden decided, as a result of New Hampshire's belligerence, not to file as a candidate on the presidential primary ballot. And, we did have a large number of lesser known candidates. I believe there were 21 Democratic candidates that did file on the presidential primary ballot. Two of them were fairly well known, Marianne Williamson and Dean Phillips, a congressman from Minnesota. And they both ran good campaigns. We had a really neat lesser known candidate forum for both Democratic and Republican candidates that wanted to give running for president a shot. And that was held at the Institute of Politics. We had really good attendance and great participation from those candidates. But in the end, there was a very aggressive write-in campaign that was organized by the Democrats in the state of New Hampshire. And the really impressive result of that was that Joe Biden received, I believe it was 79,000 write-in votes to win the presidential primary in New Hampshire. And he had more votes that were write-in votes than Barack Obama and Bill Clinton had when they were running for their second term and their name appeared on the ballot. So that was a really impressive effort that was put forth by the Democrats in New Hampshire. And I think that raised a lot of eyebrows, especially with the Democratic National Committee in Washington, D.C. So, that was a very positive event from my perspective, that we had that great participation, even though the president wasn't formally on the ballot. Another big issue that we had in this presidential primary was the issue of the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution that says that an individual, a candidate who has previously taken an oath of office, cannot hold an office if they have participated in an insurrection. So some months before the presidential primary, there were individuals from both inside and outside of New Hampshire that were making the case that Donald Trump's name should not be permitted on the Republican ballot. There were some really well-known constitutional academics that put together a couple of white papers to make a strong argument to that effect. And then New Hampshire was sued by at least one individual who filed a couple of lawsuits, who was actually a lesser known candidate on the Republican side of the ballot, making that same argument. So I had to sit down with the Attorney General early on just to review the statutes and the constitutional provisions to make sure that we understood what we were dealing with on our end in terms of making that decision. And so when we read the U.S. Constitution in terms of what the qualifications were for an individual to become a candidate for the office of president, it is simply that they had to meet the specific qualifications of being 35 years of age, a natural-born United States citizen, and they had to have lived in the country for at least 7 years. There is no other qualification that is mentioned in the United States Constitution in that section. I believe it's either Section 1, Article 2, or vice versa. So don't quote me on that specifically. But and then we looked at the New Hampshire statutes and the Declaration of Candidacy, which spells out the requirements to run for president, simply says, it restates the requirements that are in that specific section of the United States Constitution. And so we came to the conclusion, based on that, that I did not have the authority to not put Trump's name on the ballot. There are a couple of other things too that go along with that. When you look at the 14th Amendment, which was being used, it did not talk about, it's kind of abstract in that it did not say that a person could not run for president or many of the other offices that are referred to in that statute. It's not just president. It did not say anything about, due process or, what is the definition of insurrection, and, at what point might that definition kick in for other candidates down ballot. And based on that, it just seemed like it was a ripe question for the United States Supreme Court to answer in a uniform way, so that that provision would be applied to all of the states, as opposed to having a patchwork of ballots from some states where a candidate's name was on the ballot and other states where it was not, and then the chaotic climate that might result from that. And as we know, a week or so ago, the Supreme Court did, in fact, rule on the issue of, can a state administrator make the decision of whether the candidate's name should be on the ballot. And they said no, that really is up to Congress to make that decision. And there's still some unanswered questions, but they gave enough clarity and guidance on that that is no longer an issue for the moment through the primary season. And then the last thing related to the presidential primary that was really unique and unique around the country was that in the day or two prior to the primary itself, there was that robocall that was made using artificial intelligence with Joe Biden's voice, suggesting to voters, Democratic voters, that the primary was not important, that the voters should save their vote for the November election, which, just based on that language, is a form of voter suppression and inappropriate, certainly illegal. And so the Attorney General's office in New Hampshire did aggressively pursue that. The individual that was responsible is now known and is out there using the excuse that, well, he was just testing the system and wanted to show, that we need to be concerned about it. We'll see what the courts decide in that case, but in the overall scheme of things, I think it was a pretty amateurish use of artificial intelligence in an election. I think most of the people, the voters that received that phone call, took it for what it was worth. New Hampshire had a tremendous turnout in both parties, given that it was in one party it was with a candidate who was an incumbent, and the other party, a candidate for the first time who held the office of president and was running again. So there's almost two de facto incumbents running, which is also a unique aspect of this presidential primary. So I think based on that, I think we're going to have a very exciting election season this fall. And, there are some concerns that go along with that. Number one, I expect, despite what some pundits are saying out there, that certainly in New Hampshire, this is going to be an election with really high voter participation. And I would not at all be surprised to see another record turnout for a presidential general election, which is great. But we want to make sure that, we've got all of our local election officials properly trained. And we've been working hard on that. We have been engaging in efforts to increase the number of potential poll workers that might be available just to help with the numbers. Security at a number of different levels is of a concern. And, recently in some polling places, there has been some confrontations that have turned physical in New Hampshire. They're isolated, but they are occurring. And so we've been working with local election officials on strategies to be prepared for that and to help deal with it. We've been working with our state and federal law enforcement partners. We get secure briefings, classified briefings on, what type of activity is out there that might be of specific concern to New Hampshire. Unfortunately, there really is not much in that regard. But the other major concern is cybersecurity. And there just seems to be a lot of interest out there from foreign actors that are testing states' electronic databases and a lot of electronic systems generally. And so, we, excuse me. We're making sure that we have the best protection of our software systems and our cybersecurity, website activity and things like that, as we can have. And we're not relying on just in-house expertise to do that. We have engaged some really, really good vendors that have the expertise to deal with these issues at a very high level. So that's really what's on the plate at the moment. And I'd be happy to talk about now whatever the listeners are interested in having a conversation about.
Thank you. I have some very relevant questions to what you've already said. I have a person that's asking, why is it really important for New Hampshire to be first in the nation?
So that is a really good question, and I'm glad that somebody asked that, because one of the reasons that probably the primary reason that is being used as to why New Hampshire should not be first is because our electorate is not very diverse from an ethnic standpoint, and because of that, we don't reflect the makeup of America. And the response that I have to that is that there is no state. There is no single state that reflects the makeup of America. And there is no state that is more American than any other state. And so, and New Hampshire has a tremendous amount of diversity when you look at ideology, and you don't have to go any further than the state legislature to look at the issues that they debate on a regular basis, reflect the critical issues that are important to the country. And we see it all here in this state. But the real reason why New Hampshire is important is because we are a small state geographically, and we are a small state population-wise, and we have always been a state that has stood up and been for the little guy. And that's reflected in our 400-member House of Representatives, where we have the best representation ratio per legislator to the constituency that legislator represents by far than any other place, any other state in the country. And because of that, we have a location where it is very easy for a person to run a campaign without high name recognition and without a lot of money. And it is very, very easy for any individual that qualifies under the Constitution to run for president to file here in New Hampshire. Simply signing the Declaration of Candidacy, and it's paying a $1,000 filing fee. And if a person can prove that they are indigent, they in lieu of the fee, they can collect 10 signatures from voters in each of the 10 counties in New Hampshire. So it is very easy to get on the ballot. And that's why we have so many candidates on our presidential primary ballot, 21 on the Democratic this year, 24 on the Republican ballot. And it gives anybody, any American in any state that qualifies to the opportunity to exercise that fourth grade dream of growing up to be president of the United States. And there are very few, if any, other places in New Hampshire where that is still possible. In fact, it's easier to get on the New Hampshire presidential primary ballot than it is in most of the home states that these candidates came from. And so that's the dream that we need to keep alive, because if we move away from that and we start letting the large states go first, or we move to a regional or even a national primary, the only individuals that will be able to run in an election like that are ones that are really well known or really wealthy. And it eliminates that opportunity for just the average person on the street, which is what democracy is supposed to be all about. So that's the reason why I believe it's important for New Hampshire to continue to hold that role and give every American the opportunity to run for president if they want to.
And I have to say, as a voter and just a regular citizen of New Hampshire, boy, we have such a unique opportunity to be face to face with all of these candidates by being first in the nation. When you do some advocacy work and there are folks visiting from other states and they're totally jealous because we actually get to present our questions about the issues that are important to us directly to the candidate with the microphones and cameras on and get them on the record. And that's a wonderful and very unique opportunity.
And I mentioned early on that the primary is part of our culture, and that is true. It has that process and what the New Hampshire voter experiences and how they react and interact with the candidates is something that has matured over a really long period of time. I think it would be difficult to duplicate, exactly what happens in New Hampshire somewhere else early on in the process. I mean, a state could develop that over time, but it's, New Hampshire is known for its presidential primary, just like another state is, Kentucky is known for the Kentucky Derby, and Maine's known for their lobsters, but New Hampshire is known for its primary. And then the other thing is the voters here are tremendously engaged. And, I gave the example of the participation in the presidential primary, but every year that we have a general election where president is on the ballot, for the last 4, 5, 6 elections like that, 25 years, New Hampshire has been in the top 4 states in terms of voter turnout, voter participation. And, to maintain that consistent record over time is also pretty remarkable.
Indeed. I think that I'm not sure if you can answer this question or not, but someone is asking, did our primary, as far as the Democratic side of the ticket, did it actually count? And will there be delegates at the convention because it was outside of our traditional primary experience?
Well, there are different ways that a presidential primary can count. And, the primary that we just had counted from the standpoint that the media and the voters elsewhere around the country still paid a tremendous amount of attention to the results and what happened here. And that they saw that 79,000 plus voters were willing to turn out and write in President Biden's name on the presidential primary ballot. And that's a really important message, both in terms of the support that Joe Biden exhibited in New Hampshire on the Democratic side, and that the voters here still take that job seriously, that just because the DNC said we were not going to be the first state, we went ahead and did it anyway, and the voters participated in that. the threat out of the DNC was that if New Hampshire did not fall in line, then we would not have delegates that would attend the Democratic convention this summer. But delegates were assigned through the state Democratic Party, and I think they were planning on going to the convention in the summer. But shortly after the primary was over, Congressman Clyburn from South Carolina made a statement that he thought that the party, the Democratic Party, and the National Committee should put the primary events behind them, and that New Hampshire delegates should be permitted to go to the summer convention. I'm not sure that there's been a vote on that yet or not, but it seemed to be that that there was, going to be the opportunity for New Hampshire delegates to participate.
Along the lines of our election coming up, we've heard a lot about conspiracy theories. We've heard a lot about election fraud. I believe that I have heard you say, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that you feel that our elections were legitimate and clean and fair and no evidence of fraud. Is that a true story?
That's absolutely true. New Hampshire runs really great elections, and the reason that they are run so well is because we run them from the bottom up, and every polling place elects the election officials locally that are going to run that polling place, and so it's your neighbors and the members of your community that elect a moderator, a clerk, selectmen, the supervisors of the checklist to do that job. And those individuals are elected because the voters from that community have faith in them and believe that they can do that job. And so it's number one, it's putting people in place that people can trust to do the job locally. And then the elections in New Hampshire are fairly transparent. In other words, it's an open process. It's a publicly observable process from the time that the polls open up in the morning through the election day, through the polls closing and the counting of the votes and the results being announced and posted at the polling place, so that anybody that's interested, that's present, can see what those results are. And then those results are sent to the Secretary of State's office overnight so that we can compile the official returns in the days that follow. And so when something is up or looks unusual at a polling place, it's usually the local election officials that recognize it quickly. They can tell when something's out of place. And so occasionally we do find issues of inappropriate voting. It might be, usually it's people voting in the wrong location. There have been instances of a voter voting in two polling places in the same election. But those are isolated instances. They are not organized. They're not widespread. And they do get caught. And we did go through an exercise some years ago now where we matched the data from the New Hampshire voter registration database that was public data with a system called the Interstate Crosscheck Program. It was a one-time event for New Hampshire, but we matched our data up with the data from about 30 other states and received a large number, close to 100,000 matches of duplicate names in New Hampshire and another state. And through the process of elimination, by adding additional fields to the information that we received back, we were able to eliminate 99,000 of those matches as being legitimate voters, no issues. And then the remaining 1,000 got down to about 250 that we could not confirm, that we had to then send over to the Attorney General's office because they have additional databases available to them because of their law enforcement activity. And out of that exercise, there were probably about a dozen individuals that were prosecuted and convicted for voting in multiple states in the same election, which is not it's a minuscule number when you look at it. What was amazing to me in that exercise is how many individuals in this country have the same first and last name and date of birth. It is,
Wow.
it's remarkable. And then you have to use additional information to just be able to identify those individuals as two different persons.
Wow. I wouldn't think that would happen very often, but I guess I'd be wrong about that. There's an effort going on right now in a lot of our towns here in New Hampshire, and I think in other states, where folks feel uncomfortable with machine counted votes. They prefer hand counting and feel that is a less subject to fraud and more accurate way of getting the votes, to the extent where they're putting warrant articles and such on ballots in these towns and making really concerted efforts to get rid of the voting machines. Could you speak to that, please?
Sure. And that is where there are issues related to elections in terms of perception and conspiracy theories and people questioning the results, is when the voting process is not very transparent. And so, machine counted ballots is one of those areas where a voter puts their ballot into the machine receives it, and the ballot counting device then tallies those votes. And when the moderator closes the poll at the end of the night, he or she runs a report, and the report just prints out a total of the votes that every candidate received. And so it is not, I think it is probably a healthy skepticism that voters question, did the machine actually count my ballot properly? And so I understand, the concerns that are out there related to that. If you look at the history of those machines, however, there is a pretest of counting the ballots before the election to make sure that the machines are programmed properly and that they're counting the ballots properly. And so the moderator runs a test of those devices and then zeroes the tape out for the day of the election, conducts the election. And then after the election is over, there are usually more than just a few recounts. And the recounts generally match the outcome of the machine count. Not exactly, because the machines will only count the ballots that the voters have properly marked them. So if the voter fills in the oval, stays inside the lines, and there's no white space, that ballot is going to be counted. There's no question about that. But if a person circles the name of a voter and doesn't fill in the oval, the machine's not going to read that as a vote, but it will be read as a vote during a recount when human eyes are looking at it and determining what the voter intent was. Sometimes there's just a thin line that is run through the oval. The machine may or may not pick that up. I've seen some ballots where the filling in the oval is offset from the oval itself. And it might be an individual that wears thick glasses or something. They just, they're just not seeing their mark going on the right spot on the ballot. But so typically what happens is candidates tend to pick up votes when there's a recount, as opposed to the votes coming in exactly the same as reported on election night. We did have an instance in the town of Windham a couple of elections ago where the election officials there, it was during the pandemic when there was a much higher use of absentee ballots taking place. And to save time, the election officials decided to use an uncalibrated letter folder to fold the ballots. And when they did that, the ballots were not folded on the score line that comes from the printer, but instead the fold line went right through the oval of one of the candidates on the ballot. And when we did a recount of that race, it ended up being pretty close. The numbers were way off from the night of the election. And so there was an audit that was requested by the legislature of that because the reason for that difference could not be explained. And after the audit process was over, it was determined that that line that went through the oval, creating a crease, actually created a shadow that was read by the machine, even though there was not actually a vote on that point. So we learned something from that process, that we have to be really careful when folding the absentee ballots that they don't go through an oval. So the question then is, well, how do we deal with that concern about people wanting, some assurances that the machines are counting properly? And there's a couple of ways to do that. Probably the best one is having post-election audits of the voting machines when the election is over, so that we can actually compare the results of the machine to the ballots that went through that machine and make sure that the numbers match relatively well, given the issues that I mentioned earlier. New Hampshire is getting ready to roll out a couple of new ballot counting devices that were approved by the Ballot Law Commission. And one of the devices is actually going to be used in 4 or 5 towns on Tuesday when the towns hold their elections. The new devices now use digital scan technology as opposed to optical scan, which is the old version. Optical scan is simply read heads in the machine that measure the reflected light at certain locations on the ballot that tells the machine whether there's a vote there or not. The digital scan technology actually records an image of every single ballot, so that now there's a way electronically to actually look at those ballots, compare them to the results, and compare them to the paper ballots, which we will always still have. And then the device that is being used next Tuesday is by a vendor known as Voting Works. And that device uses open source software code in it so that anybody that knows how to read the code can take a look at it and see how that code was counting the ballots. Whereas most of the other vendors out there keep that information proprietary and don't, they don't share it with the general public. So there are ways coming, and the technology is allowing us to do this, to just take a second look at the results of the devices that were used, just to make sure that they were counting properly. Is that going to eliminate the concerns of everybody out there about the use of technology in counting ballots? Probably not. And I think there will always be individuals that would prefer a hand count over machine counted ballots. Our experience has been that when the ballots are properly marked, the machine counting does a much more accurate job of counting votes than tired poll workers at the end of the night. That was a long-winded answer to your question.
That was a great answer to the question. Thank you very much. Now, can we just take a step further down that same road and talk a little bit about audits? There are audits that are done, and there's been a lot of conversations about that in the legislative sessions over the past couple of years. Can you tell us how those audits are done? Are those audits done by hand count, by machine count? What is the procedure, and how are those decisions made about, because there are random audits that are not spurred by any sort of nefarious activity or whatever, that are done on a routine and regular basis, correct?
Yeah, and I think the issue of audits is going to be one that evolves over a period of time. I don't think that, that the legislature this session, and maybe even next session, is going to be able to say, this is the way we're going to do audits moving forward. And that's because we're going to be in a transition period right now with different types of machines. Some towns still hand count their ballots. But what is important is that we have a process that allows us to compare the results of the ballot counting device with the ballots that were run through the device, and comparing those with the paper ballots that were actually cast in the election. And there's several different ways that can be done. And I think that I know that there's some really well-known computer scientists in this field that have been working with the elections primarily for some time now. Mark Linderman is one of them, and I know he's been lobbying in New Hampshire on post-election audits. And there have been some professors at MIT and other places that have offered their assistance in helping New Hampshire develop an audit system in the future. And the trick is finding the sample size that gives us the assurance, making sure that it is something that we can do with the resources that we have. The thing about audits are that people want them done at the same time that we're doing certification of results and recounts and things like that. And so I firmly believe that we need to get into an audit program, but I expect that it's going to be a program that evolves over time, especially with the transitions that we're going through right now in terms of new devices and possibly changing ballot styles and things like that.
Can we talk a little bit about affidavit ballots? There is, I lost my wallet or can't find it or whatever, and the polls are going to close, and I want to go vote. So I go up there, and because I don't have my identification with me, I have to sign an affidavit that says I'm legit. I have a right to vote in this town on this day, and so forth and so on. There's some legislation. There was some legislation last year, that SB 418, that changed the affidavit rule a little bit, and now there's further legislation this year that's in progress that wants to do away with affidavits altogether. Could you share your thoughts or feelings about affidavit ballots?
Yeah, and I'll share them in a very general way because that issue is being litigated right now. And so,
okay.
I have to be careful what I say, but I can say this much, that we want to make sure that every voter in New Hampshire has the opportunity to exercise their right to vote. And we have relied on a system of audits to be able to prove qualifications in lieu of not having the physical documentation. And that has worked. The legislature has played around with different methods of following up on the affidavits that are signed, which is kind of a cumbersome process to do, but there has been follow-up on the affidavits. And, again, it's occasionally you find one, where somebody filled one out inappropriately, but it doesn't seem to be widespread. And then most states have a form. New Hampshire may be the only state, but every state in the country seems to have a form of. I'm trying to remember the name of it now. A provisional ballot. And the provisional ballot in most states works in reverse of what happens in New Hampshire at the present time. So if a voter in another state shows up at the polls and they claim that they filled out a mail-in registration form, which most states allow under motor voter, and that voter's name does not show up on the checklist, that voter may be allowed to fill out a provisional ballot that is handed in, but it is not counted until after the election when the qualifications of that voter can be proven. New Hampshire has a law now that does the opposite, where it says that if a voter does not have documentation of identity when they register to vote for the first time in New Hampshire, then their ballot is accepted and it is counted, but the voter has 7 days or 10 days to return a packet that has the documentation in it so that that vote can remain counted. And that's what's being litigated right now, that question whether that's constitutional or not. So, I mean, that's the way it works in New Hampshire. The issue of qualifications of what a voter needs to present is one of those items that is always a tug of war, between, making elections as secure as possible, knowing who every voter is and that they're qualified, versus making it as easy and convenient to vote as possible. And there's that natural tension there that is just constantly pulling at each other. And the middle, the middle ground on that is always moving in one direction or another, it seems.
Yet another voting question. We have a couple of folks who are interested in when local elections will have the accessible equipment for certain types of disability. I know that there is legislation going on right now through the process, so I'm not sure how free to speak to that you are, that speaks to assistive voting devices. One person in particular had concerns because there was an amendment, I guess, coming or something with regard to the fiscal note coming from your office or requested by your office, and that set the date back a week, and there were a lot of folks who showed up expecting it to be on one day and finding out that it was deferred to another time, and that was difficult because a lot of those folks were had some sort of challenge in being able to get to the State House, as they have challenges being able to cast their vote. So could you please speak to accessible equipment for disabled folks?
Sure. And so we have been working with the sponsors on that bill and the individuals that are asking them to sponsor that bill. And we've had some really productive, positive discussions on the direction that we're moving. Every polling place in New Hampshire for state and federal elections is required to have accessible voting equipment set up and available to any voter that needs it. And there is a growing demand in the towns that equipment be made available for local elections. And obviously they would like the state's participation and help in doing that, which is something that we are more than happy to work on but it is not an easy issue to deal with. And the reason that it is not easy is because New Hampshire has elections all the time, it seems. And, we just finished a presidential primary, and now we've got town meetings coming up. There's also school meetings that are associated with that. Sometimes those two political subdivisions have their meetings on the same day. Sometimes they have separate days for their elections and voting on warrant articles. We have village district elections that happen throughout the year, and we have the city elections. We have the city elections, which usually happen in the fall. And the primary equipment that is important for accessible voting in the polling place is a tablet, computer tablet, that is programmed for each election using software by a private vendor. And that software has to be set up in advance of the election. Doing just a straight ballot for candidates is a fairly easy process, but you still have to proof it in the same way that you would a paper ballot, where our staff have to listen to how the pronunciation of every name is taking place. The programming is developed with, it's probably artificial intelligence, but sometimes the speech doesn't get the right pronunciation. And so that has to be worked on. It takes time before the election to do that, and then get those tablets distributed to each polling place. And then when the election is over, we have to collect all of those devices back. They are cleaned and scrubbed of any software programming that's on them, just to make sure that there aren't any viruses or malicious software that may have somehow been introduced, even though they're standalone units. But we do that, and then we prepare them for the next election. So, we would be interested in sharing the equipment that we use, but the logistics of the inventory of those devices, keeping track of them, getting them back in time to reprogram them and distribute them for the next election would be a huge task. And so it would be easier, from my perspective, to simply, purchase a tablet for each political subdivision that needs them. Let them use the printers that we already use to print, to mark the ballots for the voter. And that might work. But then the next issue is the elections from municipality to municipality can be pretty different. There are some towns that still have a traditional official ballot where it's the candidates' names, and then there might be 1 or 2 or 3 warrant articles on the ballot because they're prescribed to be on the ballot by state law. But then there are other towns that are Senate Bill 2 towns, which might have 10 or more pages of warrant articles on them that have to be voted on. And the text of each of those would have to be programmed into the device so that the person using the accessible equipment could listen to each warrant article being read to them, so that they could vote on it, which would be a huge programming issue, a huge proofing issue of that programming. Just be incredibly time consuming. And it's a problem that we're struggling to find a way to resolve. So what the language of that piece of legislation now says is that the legislature will approve an expenditure to basically create a fund so that the state, my office, can use its purchasing power with vendors to make accessible voting equipment available to the cities and the towns, understanding that the needs may be different from one municipality to the next. And then it will be up to the towns, once they acquire the equipment and reimburse the state for it, to then enter into contracts with a programming vendor that will make sure that those devices are properly programmed, ready for use, and ready to go moving forward. And yeah, we'll see how that turns out. The reason that the effective date was changed was to coincide with the next state budget that gets passed, so that there are funds available to start making that happen.
Thank you. I'm gonna roll. I've got like 3 or 4 questions that have a lot of similarity to each other. So I'm gonna talk about registering high school kids to vote. Of course, that meet the age requirements for voting and so forth. There's a question about pre-registration. I'm not sure exactly what pre-registration means, but and what your thoughts are about the motor vehicle involvement. So you go register your car and you're registered to vote, kind of thing. Do we lessen the loops that young voters have to jump through to validate their right in terms of documentation that they have to show? I'm not sure that they have any other documentation requirement that any other citizen would have to register for vote. But could you speak to getting young voters, first-time voters, signed up to vote?
Yes, and we've been promoting that for some time. In fact, we're actually taking some initiative in that regard. It's really important that we can get our young people to vote early, because once they start, they tend to continue. It's getting them to register to vote for the first time and then actually go to the polls and participate in an election. And once they do it, the trend is, it's easier for them to come back and participate in future elections. So we have always encouraged high schools to talk to the students that will be 18 at the next election about that. We encourage the supervisors of the checklist to participate in registration drives to help that happen. We are going to be bringing on a person this fall that we're going to have dedicated to kind of civics education related to elections. And, part of that position is going to be to try and motivate high school and college age students to participate not only in voting in elections, but try and engage them in participating as poll workers. Try and get them excited about helping this process work and engaging them in that. And then the other thing that we are working on, and the legislature is working on this currently, is the creation of a voter portal, which would be an opportunity for any potential voter to, over the internet with their laptop, pre-fill out voter registration information and submit that to the supervisors of the checklist so that they can review it in advance of an election and a new voter actually coming in to vote. And the importance, save time on the voters' part, save time on the poll workers' part, but more importantly, because the information is now in electronic format as opposed to somebody's illegible handwriting, it will help clean up our voter registration database and make sure that information is really, really accurate. The expectation is that once a voter does that on the portal, that when they show up at the polling place, they're still going to have to sign the affidavit for voter registration, which would include the physical documentation that would be required. But I think that process will be advantageous in a number of different ways.
I have a very interesting question here from someone. The person, I'm going to read it to you too, because I don't want to, this is a complicated question, so I don't want to get it wrong. I understand why the state of New Hampshire cannot make qualified decisions on a federal position, but please address your and the BLC's authority and role in determining qualifications of non-federal positions such as state reps and state senators. The state of New Hampshire makes decisions and rulings on the U.S. Constitution, but has not acknowledged its role on Section 3 of the 14th Amendment.
That's kind of I'm not quite sure what the point of the question is, but Article 3 of the 14th Amendment is what we discussed very early when talking about the presidential primary, and that talks about an individual who has taken the oath of office and then participated in an insurrection, thereby disqualifying them from holding the office. And it is there's a list of offices. I don't know that they're specific. I don't know that president is specifically mentioned, but it seems to refer to offices at the federal and state level. And so for that article to be exercised, I think requires judicial input and clarification on just exactly what that means. And the Supreme Court last week kind of started to go down that path. I think there are more questions that need to be answered there. But in terms of my authority and then the Ballot Law Commission authority to question the qualifications of candidates, is that the qualifications to run for the various state offices and federal offices are pretty clear, and they are straightforward, and they are easy to prove or disprove. And so if a candidate comes in and signs the declaration of candidacy and the affidavit under the penalties of perjury or voter fraud, that what they're saying is true, we take that at face value unless we learn otherwise. And so an example of that in the last presidential primary election was there's a candidate whose name is Cenk Uygur, who I believe may have been born in Turkey. He was not a natural born United States citizen. And when he filed his declaration of candidacy, he crossed out that language on the declaration before he signed it. But the statutes do not allow for a candidate to modify a declaration that is required by the statute. So I told that candidate that he was not eligible to be on the ballot because he had changed the language on the declaration of candidacy and then could not prove that he was a natural born United States citizen. Now, he challenged that in a New Hampshire court and lost the challenge. Other states' laws are different because my understanding is he was able to make it on the ballot in other state primaries.
Thank you. I have a question. Some of us are involved in campaign finance and reporting and registering committees, registering as candidates and that sort of thing on your campaign finance electronic system. And it's my understanding that there is a new electronic submission software being added. Could you speak to that a little bit and when we might be seeing that?
Sure. We are in the process of getting ready to test the system, which is something that takes place shortly before gets rolled out. We're looking for volunteers to help with that testing process. So, if somebody's interested in trying to break the system before we roll it out, I would invite them to, get a hold of me or Kaylee Dion in my office is the one that's leading that up. So if you want to ask for Kaylee, and you want to help, would be thrilled by that participation. Our campaign finance laws need work. They are incredibly confusing, and they are not easy to read. We went through an exercise. We're kind of going through an exercise with a piece of legislation right now, trying to do that. I'm not sure how successful we are at doing that, but we're just trying to get back to a statute and a process that is just straightforward and really easy to understand and easy to comply with, through the submission of electronic returns. So we're doing things on our end, and if the law changes dramatically, we may have to go back to the drawing board to change software to accommodate it. But the legislature has to accept its role in this too, and try and come up with a statute that works really, really well, and is a lot less confusing than it currently is.
I have a question for you, and I'm not sure your involvement in the process at all, but as we all know, every 10 years after the census, there is a redistricting that takes place that redraws the lines of our voting districts for all of our, county executive council, state reps, state senators, and congressional district folks. There has been talk over the years about establishing an independent redistricting commission. And it's understood that I believe the Constitution, our state constitution, says that the legislature needs to actually vote on these district maps, but there could be this advisory independent commission that does all of that groundwork and so forth, and therefore then submits to the legislature going forward. Could you talk about your office's role, if at all, in redistricting, and thoughts about an independent redistricting commission?
So we stay out of the redistricting debate.
I don't blame you.
The Constitution does give the responsibility of the redistricting to the legislature. I don't know how much latitude that an interpretation of the Constitution would give to letting a third party commission or whatever do it, as long as they came back and voted on it. But that's a process that can be political at times, and especially when it comes to elections. I don't want this office to really take on a political role like that. And so we have just been hands off of the actual redistricting process itself. Our role in that is, once the districts are established, we create the ballots accordingly and make sure that the ballots reflect what the legislature has put together in terms of redistricting.
We just have a few short minutes left, but I would like to ask, we have a question about no excuses absentee voting. I think that maybe we had that during COVID, or something akin to that during COVID. Could you speak to that and tell us how you feel about it?
Sure. So our Constitution says that a voter can obtain an absentee ballot for two reasons. One, being absent from the place where they want to vote, during the election and for reasons of a disability. And so the legislature has further defined those into subcategories. Religious exemption is one that is in the statute. I suppose that somebody could argue that that's an absence if their religion says that you can't participate in an election on a religious observance day. But then in addition to that, a voter who is at their place of employment during the entire time that the polls are open can request an absentee ballot. That would include a parent or a caregiver that is taking care of children or infirm adults. Also are specifically mentioned. There is a provision as in close proximity to the election for some type of emergency, whether it's a snowstorm or something else. And then during the pandemic, there was an increased use in absentee ballots, but that was because the governor issued some executive orders, and through an interpretation with the Attorney General's office, it was determined that if someone was concerned about their safety based on broad medical advice that was given due to the pandemic, and whether what steps a person should take out in public resulted in a concern for a voter's safety, then voting by absentee was appropriate. Basically, it was a form of a disability. So I believe that for absentee voting to be expanded to no excuse, it would require a change in the state constitution to allow that to happen.
Thank you. There's a person who would like to know how candidates get on the ballot. I'm not sure what kind of candidate they were referring to, but they listed filing before the deadline, in addition by a political party, a write-in, or appearing and speaking to how candidates appear on the ballots of 2 or more parties' placeholders.
So that the question actually addressed a number of issues. So the first way a person can get on the ballot, on any ballot for state or federal election, is to sign up during the filing period. For state offices and county offices, that will be coming up on the first Wednesday in June and go through Friday of the following week. And if a person signs up during that window, then their name will appear on the state primary ballot, which at this point is in September. There's a bill in that could move it back to August, depending on when the effective date. That could happen this year. So we'll have to follow that one. After the filing period closes, if there are vacancies in any of the offices, then the political parties have an opportunity to fill the vacancy. Before, I think they have to do that by the Wednesday after the filing period closes. If a candidate is disqualified or passes away before the election, the parties have an opportunity to fill that vacancy if there is enough time to reprint the ballots. In a primary election, if there is an open seat primarily, or if a write-in candidate actually beats the person's whose name is on the ballot, then that individual would obtain ballot status and appear on the ballot in the general election. So that's how a person running in a party primary for a party nomination can get on the ballot. If a person is interested in running as a candidate for a third party or as independent, there's a process by which that person would file a declaration of intent during the June filing period, and then have until early August to collect a requisite number of nomination petitions. And depending on the office, I think I have to look up at the statute, but state representative might be 25, state senate might be 50. Running for statewide office like governor or U.S. Senate, we don't have a U.S. Senate up for election this year, but that would require 3,000 signatures statewide. Congress would be 1,500. And so if a candidate goes out and collects that number of nomination petitions and they're certified by the supervisors of the checklist and then delivered to the Secretary of State's office so they can be counted up and confirmed, then that individual will appear on the general election ballot as a third party or as an undeclared independent candidate. And then on the general election ballot, there are party columns, one for the Republican Party, one for the Democratic Party, and there would be a column for any party that receives at least 4% of the vote in the last general election. And then there's a column for other candidates, which would be the individually qualified third-party candidates. And then there's a column for write-in votes on every ballot. And then the columns are rotated on a random basis. And then the names, if there are multiple names on the ballot, excuse me, they are also rotated in different ways so that each candidate appears in the different positions on the ballot an equal number of times as possible.
That's really interesting. I've always found that kind of fascinating that we do that. As far as poll worker safety at the polls, is that a function of the individual towns and cities as to what kind of safety, security that they would provide for poll workers during an election?
It's a cooperative effort. In the first instance, the Secretary of State's office does extensive training with local election officials, and we have multiple sessions that we, especially prior to an election, that we take around the state. We go to every county and meet with the officials there, and then we talk about strategies for a safe polling place. The moderators in New Hampshire generally are really good at de-escalating, upset voters or agitated voters. But if they are unable to calm a person down, we strongly recommend that they have a police officer stationed at the polling place during an election. They don't have to be highly visible, but just to be there, just in case the need arises. And then the Attorney General's office has many individuals that they put out in the field on the day of the election, traveling around, visiting polling places. They go through a checklist to make sure that the polling places are compliant, but more importantly, they are there to deal promptly with legal issues that might arise. And so if there is a voter in a polling place and they're concerned that their rights are being violated, they're not being allowed to vote, that's the type of situation that we want to resolve as quickly as possible. So in a situation like that, if the voter or a poll worker calls the hotline number for the Attorney General's office that is posted at every polling place, they can usually have somebody there present representing them in a matter of minutes. And then the same would be true that if there was an unfortunate incident that was causing a disruption in a polling place, they can be there quickly. Law enforcement can be there quickly. And as I mentioned early on, we do have communications with our state law enforcement and federal law enforcement partners so that we have access to classified concerns about what might be happening, both physically in a polling place, but also from a cybersecurity standpoint.
I have to tell you that this has been such an incredibly informative evening, and I so appreciate, along with everyone else, your time and your attention to our questions. We have had covered a pretty good spectrum of our election process and those things related to it. So I think that we are all a little bit smarter than we were when we sat down at 7 o'clock tonight. So I thank you so very, very much for your time. I very much appreciate it. I appreciate what you do for the state of New Hampshire. Your service has been remarkable. Your career has been longstanding up there, and I'm sure it will continue. So thank you so very much for the generosity with your time tonight.
Well, thank you for the invitation, and we do pride ourselves in being a resource here. So, you know, if you or anybody has questions about process or, you know, improvements, you know, we're happy to try and help out.
Your staff is excellent. I've been working with the Hillsborough County committee. It's making people a little more aware of their compliance requirements and so forth, and getting them up to speed. And your office has been an incredible source of information for us all, and have been very, very pleasant during the process, even though there have been numerous questions for them. So I appreciate you, and I appreciate your office. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.
You too. Good night.